The first weeks of captivity were marked by tension, silence, and cautious stares as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war passed through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. Most wore worn-out uniforms, coated with sweat and dirt after months of combat and surrender. The long marches, dusty island roads, and relentless tropical heat had drained their strength, but nothing prepared them for the unfamiliar experiences awaiting them inside. After registration, medical inspections, and receiving basic supplies, the prisoners were directed into a large wooden building with exposed pipes overhead. The sight stopped many in their tracks. The structure was unlike anything they had seen in the Pacific. Rows of metal nozzles jutted out from overhead pipes, each positioned above a drain. The American guards, efficient and direct, ordered them to undress and line up. For many, it was the first moment they realized they were not simply being held, they were expected to wash. Confusion spread quickly among the men. During the war, bathing for Japanese soldiers had been rare, often improvised in rivers or the sea, and limited by constant supply shortages. Soap had been a luxury. Yet here, under the control of their former enemy, they were being guided into a structured washing process. Some held their belongings tightly, suspicious of deception. Others whispered nervously, eyeing the steam rising from the pipes. They remembered the warnings of their officers before capture, that Americans were cruel, that surrender would bring humiliation, and that prisoners would be treated worse than animals. Now, staring at the shining metal showers, they questioned whether this was some hidden form of punishment. The guards, growing impatient with their hesitation, shouted orders in English and gestured firmly. Shoes, belts, tunics, everything had to be removed. One by one, reluctant hands unfastened buttons, and bodies marked by jungle campaigns stood exposed. The prisoners felt exposed and humiliated in front of strangers and one another. Still, they complied, gripping the bars of soap handed to them. Then came the sound of water. From the overhead pipes flowed streams of clean water, warm to the touch. The sudden heat startled the men. For a moment, they froze, bracing for pain. But as the water ran down their backs and shoulders, rinsing away layers of filth, an unfamiliar sense of calm settled over them. Some closed their eyes, watching the dirt swirl away into the drains. Others rubbed themselves carefully with the coarse soap, as if unsure whether this was truly permitted. Gradually, their initial fear gave way to quiet amazement. They hadn't experienced such warmth and cleanliness in months, some in years. On the islands where they had fought, water had been rationed, showers were rare, and lice and disease were constant. Standing beneath a steady flow of hot water, without buckets, without shouting officers, without restrictions, felt like an unimaginable luxury. Here, in enemy hands, they were cleaner than they had ever been in their own military barracks. When they stepped out, thick cotton towels were waiting for them, neatly folded in stacks. Many prisoners touched the towels, as if they were relics from another world. They dried themselves clumsily, unfamiliar with such fabric. For the Americans, this was routine camp practice. For the Japanese, it felt extraordinary. They shuffled out with dripping hair and skin flushed from the warmth, a quiet wave of amazement passing through the group. The fear that had gripped them when entering the shower hall was replaced by confusion. Had their captors truly offered them comfort instead of cruelty? That first experience with the camp shower stayed with them long after. It marked the beginning of a series of moments that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. It wasn't just about cleaning their bodies. It was about confronting the gap between the warnings they had believed and the reality they were now living. The modern showers, with their constant flow of hot water and soap, became a symbol of something greater. The realization that captivity might not equal degradation, but could offer an unexpected look into another culture's way of life. When the showers ended and the prisoners returned to their barracks, a heavy silence filled the room. They sat on wooden benches, some holding their folded uniforms, others rubbing their hair with the thick towels, uncertain whether what they had experienced was a genuine kindness or a hidden trap. Many avoided each other's gaze, as if speaking openly would break an unspoken rule. Inside, though, a quiet discomfort remained. They had been warned repeatedly that surrendering to Americans meant shame, torture, and death. Before battles, officers had described cruel enemy camps filled with hunger and abuse. Yet here, the first act forced upon them was bathing with soap and hot water. To many, it felt suspicious, too kind, too civilized. One prisoner, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka, remembered Allied propaganda leaflets showing smiling POWs receiving food and rest. He had always dismissed those leaflets as lies meant to weaken Japanese morale. Now clean for the first time in months, he recalled those wartime illustrations with a chill. Could some of them have been true? Then a darker, more unsettling thought surfaced. What if the showers weren't for hygiene at all? Rumors spread quickly, especially among those who still remembered propaganda clearly. Whispers of gas chambers began to circulate, drawing comparisons to vague stories they had heard about the Germans in Europe. Few knew specifics, but the idea that Americans might use showers for hidden cruelty grew quietly among them. Guards noticed their hesitation. Groups of prisoners paused at the entrances, their faces marked by suspicion. Orders were repeated, and interpreters explained in broken Japanese that bathing was simply a required health measure. But mistrust lingered. For men raised to believe surrender was worse than death, any gesture of comfort carried a hint of deception. Some questioned whether the soap had been poisoned or whether the warm water hid something dangerous. A few refused to wash completely, only wetting their arms and backs before stepping out. The moment was intensified by cultural differences. In Japan, bathing held deep significance, linked to purification rituals in communal hot springs and baths. But months of war had stripped that away. Soldiers had gone unwashed for weeks, infested with lice and battling infections. In contrast, the camp showers were stark and utilitarian. Rows of steel pipes and drains, efficient but without privacy, running on a strict schedule. For the Americans, it was simply practical hygiene, nothing more. To the Japanese prisoners, the experience felt unfamiliar, mechanical, and almost dehumanizing. What was once a spiritual ritual had been turned into something functional but unsettling. For several days, their conversations circled around the same questions. Why would the Americans use hot water on captives? Why provide soap, towels, and time when they could have left them dirty? Was this true generosity or part of a larger strategy to break their spirits? Theories spread through the dimly lit barracks. Some believed the showers were a method of control, a way to weaken resistance by offering comfort. Others whispered that chemicals might be hidden in the water. Fear held firm, reinforced by memories of their superiors' warnings. Yet no punishment came. No hidden cruelty appeared. Each night, they returned to the barracks alive, cleaner than before. Gradually, suspicion began to fade, replaced by a quieter, reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the routine day after day. Soap was handed out regularly. Guards ensured everyone entered the shower hall, and still nothing harmful happened. Doubt remained, but it now mixed with confusion. What kind of enemy cared if prisoners were clean or carried fewer lice? For men taught that capture was worse than death, this realization was as unsettling as the showers themselves. Over time, hygiene became part of daily camp life. At first, it felt forced. Each morning or evening, depending on the schedule, guards lined them up and marched them to the shower hall. At the entrance, they were given soap wrapped in paper with a sharp chemical scent unfamiliar to them, and towels often stamped with military markings. The process was orderly. Undress, step under the water, wash thoroughly, dry, dress, and return. As days turned into weeks, they understood this was not temporary. Cleanliness was enforced as strictly as curfews and roll calls. Through interpreters, the Americans explained hygiene standards, demonstrating proper use of soap, and insisting that prisoners clean not only their arms and faces, but also their hair, feet, and less visible areas. Afterward, medics checked for lice, inspecting clothing seams and bedding with care. Delousing powder was distributed alongside clean undergarments. For many Japanese soldiers, This was the first time they understood that the Americans treated disease prevention with the same seriousness as food or weapons. To the Americans, hygiene was not a luxury. It was essential for maintaining order, health, and discipline in the camp. For the prisoners, this routine brought a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. On one hand, they were stripped of individuality, required to bathe on command like schoolboys. On the other hand, living without constant itching, sores, and untreated wounds proved unexpectedly manageable. One corporal who had served on Guadalcanal remembered going weeks with only brief baths in muddy streams, while tropical ulcers spread among his fellow soldiers. In contrast, after a few weeks of enforced showers, the sores on his legs began to heal, and his persistent cough eased. It was a quiet but undeniable improvement, an irony that weighed on his pride. At first, language barriers created frequent misunderstandings. Many prisoners didn't fully grasp the shouted instructions about washing their hair or scrubbing their feet, so they often did the bare minimum. When they tried to skip steps, guards sent them back under the water, watching closely until the soap lathered properly. Some found the process degrading and muttered their discontent, but even they couldn't ignore the results. Their regularly laundered uniforms no longer carried the foul smell of decaying fabric. Blankets carried a faint scent of detergent instead of sweat and mildew. The barracks, once stifling with the odor of unwashed bodies, became noticeably more tolerable, even for those who never said so openly. Over time, suspicion slowly gave way to habit. Prisoners began to expect the daily hygiene routine, lining up with less resistance. They learned to wash more thoroughly, dry themselves carefully, and fold their towels as instructed. Some even compared different types of soap, noting which lathered better or had a less harsh smell. It was a small detail, but for men deprived of freedom, these comparisons became a form of conversation, something to fill the long, idle hours. Hygiene had shifted from being an order to becoming a shared routine, a quiet ritual that connected them. What struck many prisoners most was the realization that their captors expected them to maintain dignity even while imprisoned. Being ordered to shower and given soap wasn't only about preventing disease. It was about enforcing a certain standard of humanity. In the Japanese army, soldiers had been taught that comfort was weakness, and that enduring dirt and discomfort showed strength. Under their enemy's strict system, they were now shown that regular washing could be as much a part of discipline as carrying a rifle. This clash of values unsettled many, but it also planted the first seeds of hesitant respect for the unfamiliar, structured ways of their captors. The first time hot water poured over their shoulders, many Japanese prisoners gasped, some even stepping back as if burned. The warmth was steady and controlled, flowing from the overhead nozzles in a way they had never known. For men used to washing in cold rivers or with hastily filled buckets, the sensation felt almost luxurious. Steam rose quickly, softening the harsh lights of the Baroque-style shower room. The foreign-smelling soap foamed thickly on their skin, lifting away months of dirt. They rubbed it on themselves carefully at first, then more confidently, surprised by how the lather clung and rinsed off easily. For some, the experience was overwhelming. They remembered how, during long campaigns in the jungles, officers had told them to conserve every drop of water. That cleanliness came second to survival. On remote islands, proper baths were rare. Soldiers wiped down with rags, their skin constantly coated with sweat, salt, and dust. On the rare occasions when hot water could be heated in cans or drums, it was considered a special privilege, shared among many men. Here, however, each prisoner stood beneath his own steady stream of hot water, as if such comfort had no end. It wasn't simply bathing, it felt like stepping into a different world. The towels that followed added to their astonishment. Thick and absorbent, they were unlike the thin, shared cloths once used in Japanese barracks, where rags were passed between men. Prisoners pressed the towels against their faces, breathing in the faint chemical scent of detergent. Their skin felt refreshed, pores open, the sticky film of the tropics finally washed away. It brought more than physical relief. It stirred long-suppressed emotions. Some recalled family baths back home, memories of mothers filling wooden tubs before war took over their lives. Others remembered public bathhouses, now distant echoes of civilian life. The camp showers revived those sensations, though now shaped by the strangeness of captivity. For the Americans, the showers were routine, soap and towels distributed with the same efficient precision as rations. To them, it was about hygiene, disease prevention, and order. But to the prisoners, it was a quiet revelation. The irony was sharp. They had expected cruelty, yet here they experienced a comfort greater than what they had received in their own army. Some felt shame, believing such comfort weakened their resolve. Others accepted it silently, grateful for a brief moment that made their worn bodies feel human again. Over time, these showers transformed their daily existence. Instead of scratching lice or ignoring untreated wounds, they discovered that hot water eased pain and promoted healing. Their hair, once greasy and tangled, became softer and easier to comb. The constant smell of sweat that clung to their uniforms faded, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant soap. Even the air inside the barracks became lighter as regular bathing reduced the odors of so many men living in confinement. The prisoners noticed these changes with quiet surprise, admitting to themselves that they were healthier than they had been during combat. The paradox weighed on their minds. How could the enemy they were taught to despise provide care their own army had never offered? The showers became more than a matter of cleanliness. They represented a system so organized, with resources so plentiful, that it could offer comfort even to captives. Standing under streams of hot water, they couldn't ignore the mix of envy and unease. It reminded them how different this world was from the one they had left behind, and how far their homeland lagged in offering even basic dignity to its soldiers. At night, when the barracks dimmed and rows of prisoners lay in silence, conversations often returned to these comparisons. The topic wasn't weapons or battles, but the unexpected discovery of hygiene. Men who had marched across Burma and fought in the jungles of the Philippines now whispered about soap, towels, and hot water. Such conversations were never part of military pride, but the difference was too great to overlook. In the Japanese army, bathing had been rare, done only when conditions allowed. Officers praised endurance, encouraging soldiers to ignore discomfort and accept filth as proof of toughness. Many went weeks without washing, their skin coated in grime, uniforms stiff with salt from dried sweat. Lice and fleas infested seams, tropical ulcers spread untreated, and the stench of unwashed bodies followed every march and every night in the field. Complaining about it was seen as weakness, unworthy of a true warrior. In the American camps, hygiene was enforced with the same seriousness as discipline itself. One former sergeant recalled how, on New Guinea, his unit had shared a single rusty basin of water among 30 men. They had only rinsed their faces and hands. Real bathing was out of the question. He compared it bitterly to the constant flow of hot water available in captivity. Another man muttered that in Manchuria, his regiment had suffered frostbite not only from the cold, but also from wearing the same unwashed socks for months. Illness had disabled entire units more effectively than enemy fire. Now, in the U.S. camps, every prisoner washes feet daily, and medics inspected them for infection as if they were patients to be cared for. The contrast was striking, and it left a sharp impression. This realization quietly spread throughout the camp. Even the most proud among them couldn't deny the physical changes taking place. Skin rashes faded, lice vanished, and sores healed. Stomachs that had once twisted with parasites began to settle thanks to regular washing and clean clothing. Prisoners slowly recognized that these improvements were tied to the routines they had once resisted. For the first time, they began to understand that hygiene was not a sign of softness, but a powerful defense against disease, more effective than sheer endurance. These reflections extended beyond physical health. They were also cultural. Many remembered Japan's long traditions of communal bathing, mountain onsen, wooden tubs in village homes, evening rituals with family. Bathing had once been a deeply rooted part of life. War had stripped that away, reducing men to survival and filth. Now, in captivity, their enemy had returned to them something their own army had taken. This paradox unsettled many. Some spoke of it wistfully, recalling the warmth of home and mothers heating kettles at night. Others fell silent, uneasy that it was America, not Japan, that had restored this sense of dignity. The guards, meanwhile, remained unaware of the emotional weight of these changes. To them, hygiene was simply a matter of regulation and public health. Orders were given without emotion, never considering that routine showers held such deep significance for the prisoners. Inside the fenced camp, men lay awake at night, staring at the rafters, realizing that the military structure they had trusted for years was flawed. Enduring filth was not strength, and ignoring disease was not honor. Many began to wonder, if America cares this much for the health of captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? The thought was unsettling, but impossible to ignore. Weeks turned into months, and the hygiene routines that once felt foreign became part of the daily rhythm of captivity. Everyone knew the schedule: wake up, roll call, meals, and, at set times, the walk to the showers. What had once been met with suspicion slowly turned into an unspoken habit. Guards no longer needed to shout, and prisoners no longer dragged their feet. They moved in orderly lines, soap in their hands, towels over their shoulders, as if it had always been normal. The transformation was not just physical, but mental. These Japanese soldiers, stripped of weapons and their cause, regained something unexpected, a sense of dignity. Their freshly washed uniforms no longer carried the stench of decay. Their bodies, now cleaned and checked, were free of lice and infected wounds. Even their reflections in rain puddles showed healthier faces, cheeks less sunken, skin less marked by sores. It was an improvement that everyone noticed, even if few would say it aloud. Cleanliness began to represent more than survival. It showed they had not been completely reduced to shadows of themselves. The change spread through the barracks. Coughing decreased. The constant scratching of lice-infested scalps faded. Blankets carried the faint scent of soap instead of mold. Guards even remarked, sometimes jokingly, that the prisoners looked more disciplined than when they had first arrived. Some POWs, embarrassed by these comments, tried to resist the idea, believing such routines were meant to weaken them. Yet the truth was clear. They felt stronger. Their wounds healed faster, their sleep improved, and their energy, though still confined, grew steadier. For some, this shift stirred quiet pride. They began folding towels neatly, polishing boots with care, and keeping their barracks clean. It reminded them of the customs of their homes in Japan, where cleanliness had long been a valued tradition. They came to see that cleanliness was not submission to the enemy. It was a way of reclaiming parts of themselves that war had buried. Conversations changed too. Men who were once too tired to speak now exchanged quiet remarks about the strange feeling of being refreshed and the irony that they were healthier in captivity than on the battlefield. American medics, practical and unsentimental, kept careful records. Fewer cases of dysentery, fewer infestations, fewer deaths. For the Americans, it proved their system worked. For the Japanese, it was an awakening. They couldn't help but see that their captors treated hygiene as discipline and respect, not a luxury, but a standard. This realization unsettled many, as it stood in sharp contrast to their own military traditions, where enduring filth had been a mark of honor. Here, the opposite was true. Cleanliness meant order, and order symbolized strength. Over time, the suspicion that once surrounded the showers faded almost completely. Men stopped whispering about poison hidden in the soap or cruelty concealed behind the pipes. Instead, they began to look forward to the warmth, even craving it. The routine became a brief moment of comfort in lives otherwise deprived of freedom. Some prisoners stayed under the streams longer than allowed, eyes closed, letting the water run over them as though it could wash away not just dirt, but the weight of defeat. In those quiet routines, Many realized that hygiene was more than a rule enforced by guards. It was a way to regain dignity, to feel human again inside the wire fences. It was a subtle but undeniable transformation, one that affected not just their bodies but their understanding of endurance. By the time autumn winds swept across the camp and daylight shortened, the conversations among prisoners had changed. Gone were the hushed debates about hidden poison or disguised cruelty. Instead, they spoke with a new kind of wonder. They had come to see these daily rituals of soap, hot water, and towels as symbols of something greater. In the dim barracks, where men sat cross-legged on their bunks, they shared stories of their first encounters with the showers. Awkward laughter filled the room as they recalled their initial fear and marveled at how normal it had become. One prisoner, a former stern infantry officer, admitted that when he first stepped into the steaming chamber, he thought it was a trap. Others chuckled at the memory, many quietly acknowledging they had felt the same dread. A younger man compared the camp showers to the grand public bathhouses of Tokyo he'd visited as a child. His words stirred a wave of nostalgia, carrying the men back to tiled floors, wooden buckets, and evenings shared with family and neighbors. The irony struck them all. It was in enemy hands that fragments of those memories returned. What unsettled them most was not the showers themselves, but what they revealed about America. If this country could provide unlimited hot water to its prisoners, what must it offer its own soldiers? If soap and towels were given out freely here, what comforts waited on bases back home? The contrast gnawed at them. They remembered comrades who died from infection when clean water wasn't available. Soldiers who marched with lice burrowing into their scalps. Men who didn't just starve but slowly deteriorated from filth and disease. Realizing that their captors placed such importance on hygiene led many prisoners to quietly admit, though never too openly, that this might be one of the sources of American strength. Conversations at the mess hall tables became more candid over meals of bread, potatoes, and beans. Some openly shared their surprise. Before their capture, they had imagined Americans as brutal and uncivilized. Instead, they found them to be organized and systematic, even when it came to something as routine as bathing. A few went further, suggesting that this emphasis on cleanliness reflected a broader culture built on abundance and efficiency, one with enough resources to extend such standards even to their enemies. These ideas stirred debates, as not all prisoners were willing to acknowledge these unsettling observations. Pride remained, and many resisted the notion of American superiority. Yet the evidence was difficult to deny. Their cleaner skin, healed wounds, and improved health spoke for themselves. For some, this understanding turned bitter. They whispered that this comfort was meant to weaken them, to erode the endurance once central to Japanese soldiers. Others, however, felt a hesitant respect growing. They began to view the showers not just as hygiene routines, but as a reflection of the immense resources, industrial capability, and distinct philosophy of their captors. In quiet conversations, a few even admitted that the experience changed how they imagined the world beyond the barbed wire. Showers once feared as instruments of cruelty became places of realization. They were no longer just about soap and water. They represented the stark differences between two worlds. The prisoners recognized that their enemy's strength was rooted not only in weapons, but in systems of life so structured that even prisoners became part of that discipline. Years later, when many Japanese soldiers returned home after the war, their memories of captivity remained complicated, marked by shame, relief, and uncertainty. Yet among the many impressions etched into their minds, one stood out with remarkable clarity: the showers. Men who had fought across distant islands, surviving ambushes and bombardments, remembered most vividly the sensation of hot water pouring from pipes, the foam of soap in their hands, and an enforced rhythm of cleanliness that had first unsettled and then changed them. Some former prisoners recounted these experiences to their families, awkwardly describing how the Americans had insisted on daily hygiene. Their wives and mothers listened with disbelief, wondering how an enemy could have shown such care. Some remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge that captivity had offered them more comfort than their own army ever had. Yet privately, many admitted that the hygiene standards in the camps changed how they viewed the world. The memory of endless hot water stood as evidence of a society that was modern, abundant, and organized in ways that Japan, despite its discipline and tradition, could not match during the war. Their recollections were not sentimental. At first, showers had felt strange, humiliating, even frightening. But as disease declined, wounds healed, and lice disappeared, their feelings shifted. Cleanliness began to represent strength. They came to understand that health was not just a privilege, but a weapon, one that America used quietly but effectively. In conversations after returning home, some acknowledged that this was perhaps the most significant lesson they carried back. Not about military tactics, but about the influence of modern living standards. Historians who later interviewed them noticed how frequently showers appeared in their testimonies. Unlike food or work assignments, which varied between camps, hygiene routines were nearly universal. They left a stronger mark than bread or cigarettes. Men who had endured starvation during the war could manage the camp rations without surprise. But being given soap and towels and led into rooms filled with hot steam was unforgettable. It was entirely foreign to their wartime reality. It didn't symbolize indulgence, but a completely different worldview, one in which the enemy still recognized prisoners as humans who should remain clean. The impact lasted long after the war. Some former prisoners, once back in civilian life, kept the habits they had adopted in captivity. They washed regularly, valued soap even when it was scarce, and taught their children that hygiene was a discipline, not a weakness. For them, camp showers were not just routines. They were eye-opening experiences, lessons carried through the years. In hindsight, the memory was bittersweet. It reminded them of defeat, surrender, and captivity. But it also reminded them of survival and of a dignity they had not expected from an enemy they were taught to despise. For many, this contradiction defined their wartime experience. In a moment of humiliation, they encountered a version of modernity they could never forget. The showers were not merely about soap and water. They were about discovering that cleanliness, structure, and care, even in captivity, could reshape how a person understood his place in the world.